Myself. My name is Ayyā Suvīrā. Suvira is my personal name. I is a title that we sometimes use for Buddhist nuns. I'm a bhikkhunī in the Theravāda tradition of Buddhism. So by bhikkhunī, I mean that I'm a fully ordained nun. I have 311 rules that I keep. My preceptor was Ayyā Santinī of Indonesia, quite a long-standing bhikkhunī who's been a prominent figure in the Theravāda bhikkhunī revival. My monk teacher is Ajahn Brahm. So, the story behind why I chose this particular text, it was actually Ajahn Brahm's recommendation that it is something he's been running at the BSWA, and he thought it would be a good idea to use this particular text as an entry to Buddhist thought. So I'll get screen sharing up now. Oh, okay, I can't. I think I have screen sharing disabled. Is it possible to enable it?
Yep, that's done.
Okay. Great. Share desktop. So you should be able to see my screen. So this particular text was put together by Venerable Nyanatiloka. The version that I have has been edited heavily by Ajahn Brahm. So some of the wording, it's meant to be a little bit more accessible, and that he's changed around some of Venerable Nyanatiloka's terms. And he's also, this is also the condensed version. He's cut out some of the repetition. So we'll be going through some key themes in Buddhism, like the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path, which is good because sometimes when we talk about Buddhism, we never really get a chance to talk about what actually is core Buddhism. There's a lot of things taught as Buddhism, but this is likely the definition that the historical Buddha himself would give. And the source for these teachings that we have, you can see the little numbers on the left-hand side of the page. Those are actually reference numbers for the Pali Canon. So there are three major canons of Buddhist teachings which are extant today. So of them, the most commonly used ones are the Pali Canon, which is used within the Theravāda tradition. So Pali, it's a Middle Indo-Aryan language. So middle meaning that it's between Old Indo-Aryan, it's between Vedic, and New Indo-Aryan. So like languages like Hindi, it's in the middle. And it's a Prakrit, so it was a spoken language. So we have this body of texts that was originally handed down in the Pali language. And that's the source of what I'll be teaching in this program. There are other canons, which also contain Buddhist texts. One of them that's commonly used within the Chinese or East Asian tradition is the Taisho Tripitaka. Again, it's a very expanded canon because it includes things that the Pali Canon doesn't, things like histories, things like Mahayana sutras, etc., etc., etc. And the other canon, which is widely used today, is the Tibetan Cannon, which consists of two parts, the Kangyur and the Tengyur. So it has one section for Vinaya and Sutra, and another section which is called treatises, which includes also things like medical texts. And again, it's also a very expanded canon, in the sense that it includes tantric texts as well. So yeah, a couple of characteristics of the Pali Canon. The first of them is that the language is Pali. The second of the characteristics of the Pali Canon is that it has a more restricted focus, in that while the boundaries of what's actually canonical have always been a little bit contested, it hasn't been significantly expanded to include Mahayana material. So anyway, enough about the canon. So when we see that little reference on the side, that Digha Nikaya 16, so D is for Digha. Digha means long. Nikaya means collection. So we're in the long discourses and we're at number 16. So if you wanted to look up this reference, what you do, you could actually go to Sutta Central. So we'll go suttacentral.net. So this is a website that actually has the suttas, or the Buddha's discourses, which we refer to as suttas. And you could actually go basket of discourses, collections of long discourses, Digha Nikaya, and you can see there's 3 books there within the Digha Nikaya, but this is number 16. So we can see it's in the great chapter in the Mahavagga between DN 14 and 23. And we could find that this discourse is actually the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. And, you could actually just call up the translation there. So as we go through, we'll become exposed to more books from within the Pali Canon. So, I've just introduced a few concepts there that might be new. Do we have any questions so far? If we have questions, it's okay just to put them directly into the chat, and I can take a few questions now before we go any further.
There's no questions on the chat at the moment.
No questions? That's good, because I had something else I wanted to show you all as well too, which is actually the map. Because you can see, talking about what the Pali Canon is, that I hope you can all see that. Tina, can you see the map of the Tipitaka there?
Yes, we can see it.
You can see it, great. Because you see within the Tripitaka, we actually, there's actually 3 collections. So this T means 3, Pitaka means baskets. So in terms of the 3 baskets of the Buddhist canon, of the Pali Canon, we can see basket number 1 is the Vinaya Pitaka. So this is the book of the Monastic Code. And you can see its subdivisions separated there into the rules for monks and the rules for nuns. So the rules for monks are actually over here. Their analysis is in the Mahavibhanga. And the analysis of the rules for nuns is over here in the Bhikkhunī Vibhanga. Some minor monastic rules in the Khandaka, again subdivided by monks and nuns, with the monks' rules in the Mahavagga and the nuns' rules in the Chulavagga. We also have the Sutta Pitaka, which is the collection of discourses, so the Buddha's teachings. And within that we have 5 Nikayas, 5 collections. So we can see the first text we'll be reading actually comes from over here in the Digha Nikaya, the long discourses. But we have some other collections too. We have the Majjhima Nikaya, which are the middle length discourses, the Samyutta Nikaya, which are the collected discourses, the Anguttara Nikaya, which are the numbered discourses, and the Khuddaka Nikaya, which are the, I think it's the, the short discourses. So you might have heard of texts like the Dhammapada, so that's where they come within the canon. And we also have the 3rd Pitaka, which is the Abidama Pitika. So the Abidama being like the philosophical abstraction of the Buddha's teachings. So the Sutta Pitaka over here is in prose, but the Abhidhamma is condensed. So you just find lists as opposed to these, the stories and the other content that you find in the Sutta Pitaka. So when I say a sutta, now you know what I'm talking about. We're talking about a discourse that comes from within this basket of the canon. So let's have a look at the text. I mean, if we were doing this as a group, what I'd do, I'd get everyone to read out a paragraph, but it might not work so easily on the Zoom, unfortunately. So please bear with me. I can read out and then we can have a look at, what the text is trying to say. So when we think about Buddhism, what we think about happiness. I know a lot of people have this kind of impression that Buddhists are happy people. And the Buddha did say that. The Buddha said that the Noble Eightfold Path is to be walked with joy. And studies have actually shown, there's been studies of observant Buddhist populations in countries like Thailand. And, the results are that those Buddhists who actively participate in things like temple activities, in charity, do actually have overall higher levels of life satisfaction than, than Buddhists who don't. So there is actually, it's not just an impression in people's mind. There is actually a statistical correlation between being an engaged Buddhist and being happier. And this particular study I'm quoting was Windsor, Samotchuk and Gray. That was in 2018 in the Journal of Population and Social Studies. They had about 25,000 participants. So, we think Buddhists are happy, and then we have to look at the Four Noble Truths. And, the first thing we have right up in our faces is we have to talk about suffering. And sometimes for people that can be a little bit difficult to engage because they've come and, you want to learn about Buddhism. And now we have to talk about suffering. So I hope everyone can please bear with it, because yes, we do have to talk about suffering, but we will actually, the reason we're talking about suffering is to get to the way out of suffering. It's not just to be pessimistic. So reading from the Mahaparinibbana Sutta at Digha Nikaya 16. Then the Buddha addressed the community thus: It is through not fully understanding and penetrating the Four Noble Truths that I, as well as you, have experienced the cycle of rebirth and death for a very long time. Because of not fully understanding the noble truth of suffering, we have experienced the cycle of rebirth and death. By not fully understanding the noble truth of the origin of suffering, the noble truth of the cessation of suffering, and the noble truth of the path leading to the cessation of suffering, that we have for a long time experienced the cycle of rebirth and death. So is this looking familiar? Is there anyone who hasn't seen this before? Is there anyone for whom this is completely?
Hi, me. I just joined.
I mean, just in the chat is okay.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing many of you may have seen this before, because obviously this is the Four Noble Truths. So the Buddha is saying, why do we get reborn? And, the basic cause of us getting reborn is because we don't understand the Four Noble Truths. So let's continue reading. And sometimes these Four Noble Truths are actually summed up very succinctly. So we have truth number 1, which is the truth of suffering, the second, which is the origin, the third, which is cessation, and the fourth, which is the path. So you can actually have just 4-word summary. So suffering, origin, cessation, the path. And continuing on. So we've changed text here. We've changed to the Samyutta Nikaya at 56.11. So in the linked discourses. And this is actually the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. This is the Buddha's first sermon to the group of 5 monks at the deer park at Isipatana. So the 5 monks being Kondanya, Badya, Vapa, Mahanama, and Asaji. So you can still go there today. I'll get the photo up for you all on the internet. We can have a look at the Dhammacakka Stupa at Sanat, because they have a very lovely park there. You can go and see the place where this happened at the deer park. And there are still deer. So it very much, you could imagine what it might have been like. So, I mean, that's the stupa that exists there today at this particular site where the Buddha taught his first sermon after awakening. So that's Sana. So the text continues. So long as my penetration and insight into these 4 noble truths, as they really are, was not thoroughly complete in their 3 phases and 12 aspects, then I did not claim to have awakened to the unsurpassed perfect enlightenment in this world. In the chat, does anyone know what the 3 phases are? I'm just having difficulty navigating back to my Zoom screen, so I can't really see anything. More, chat. I have a suggestion from Michael, Sila Samadhi Panya. I mean, that's a, you know, it's a good guess, right? Because we have these 3 divisions of Sila Samadhi Panya. And normally we use these divisions to analyze the Noble Eightfold Path, where you have the Sila Kanda, the Samadhi Kanda, and the Panya Kanda. So for anyone who's maybe, you know, new to these terms, Sila is our ethical conduct, Samadhi is meditation, and Panya is wisdom. I get into trouble with Bhante Sujato when I say Samadhi is meditation. You know, Samadhi has a sense that can be something like, you know, illumination. It's a very refined state. And Panya being wisdom. So if you have experience with Sanskrit Buddhism, you might know these terms as Shila, Samadhi, and Prajna. It's the same thing. So yes, we do have a set of ethics, meditation, and wisdom, talking about the Noble Eightfold Path, but that's not actually what the Buddha is talking about here. So Wei Chuang Ang has suggested study, practice, and release. I mean,
Realize.
Oh, sorry, and realization. Okay, sorry. So, I mean, in Pali, you know, that would be pariyati, paripati, and pativeda. This particular term, like this particular set of terminology is something which occurs in the commentaries. So, I mean, it's also a very nice set of analyzing the Buddha's teachings, right? Where you have study, practice, and release, because, you know, what are we doing now? We're studying. What do we take away? Hopefully, fingers crossed, we can take away something that we can go back and understand something more about our lives and about, you know, why were we born? What's our role in the universe? And eventually realize awakening, which is the goal of Buddhism. So, I mean, it's a good suggestion. But again, I don't think it's really what's going on here. And Noveline has suggested Lobha, Dosa, and Moha. See, this is a good education, actually, for anyone who's joining us for the first time today. We get to learn some Pali words. Again, if you're used to Sanskrit Buddhism, Lobha, Dosa, Moha, I think it would be Lobha, Dvesha, Moha. So greed, hatred, and delusion. So those 3, they're like the gang of 3 in Buddhism. They're the 3 negative roots that are responsible for all of our, you know, unwholesome mind states. But again, not quite the the Gang of Three were looking for. Oh, okay, Zen's got it. See, thank you, Zen. So that's perfect. So when we talk about the three phases, so the first one is Satya, the first one is the truth. So, the statement, that's the first thing that the Buddha's known. The second thing is Kitcha, what is to be done, the duty. And the third thing is Katha, what has been done. So that's what's meant by the three phases. But thank you everyone for your participation. It makes life a lot easier for me because I like to be talking to people. Otherwise, I feel like I'm just talking to myself and it's not as much fun. Okay, so what the Buddha is saying was that as long as he didn't understand these Four Noble Truths as they really are in their three phases, so in terms of the truth, what should be done in relation to the truth and what has been done in relation to the truth, so that he's actually realized the truth, and 12 aspects, then I did not claim to have awakened to the unsurpassed perfect enlightenment in this world. And for the benefit of anyone, who might be a little bit finding it hard to follow just orally, I did actually prepare a document where I had those three phases and 12 aspects in my document. Open recent documents. So we can see those Four Noble Truths, the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, and the truth of the cessation of suffering, and the path broken down into actually 4 by 3 to give us 12. So that's what's meant by that, the 12 aspects. So the first noble truth, the truth of suffering, is to be fully understood. There's a verb that goes with it. And the cause of suffering is to be abandoned. Again, another verb that goes with it. The cessation of suffering is to be realized. And the path to the cessation of suffering is to be cultivated. So actually, not only do we have 4 noble truths, we have 4 verbs that go with the noble truths. So Buddhism, it isn't just an intellectual activity, it's a path of practice. So we already, the Buddha's just started teaching. This is right at the beginning of the Buddha's career, but we're already seeing that there's a job that needs to be done in relation to what the Buddha's realized as part of his awakening experience. So that document, I have put it on the Metta Rama website as well. It's under Dhamma program, if you'd like to refer back to it in your own time. So I think, so the Buddha here is just recapping what he's actually realized. And the traditional account, the account that's found in the post-canonical Pali literature in the Nirvana Katha, is that, the Buddha in the last watch of the night as Venus was rising, that was when he realized the awakening. So he's describing what he's realized. This is the noble truth of suffering. Suffering is to be fully understood. Suffering has been fully understood. So that's the verb. It is to be understood and it has been understood. He's done it. This is the noble truth of the origin of suffering, wanting, causing, rebirth. So sometimes, you do find people who'd like to seriously argue that the Buddha didn't teach about rebirth, which we can see is incorrect, because here the Pali word is pono bhavika, pono meaning punar, again, bhava meaning a state of existence. So what the Buddha is saying, what is the cause of suffering? Suffering is that thirst, that desire, that wanting, which leads us to be reborn. So pretty straightforward definition here. And we can see that in our lives, that all of our desire and wanting, it's a huge cause of suffering. It's what keeps us from ever being still and ever just being content. And for me personally, that was the first time I read that. That was instrumental in my decision to become a Buddhist, because it's something you can see. You don't need anyone to invent a complicated argument to show you why desire causes suffering, because you know it. It's like touching the hot stove. You know it's hot. Desire is always uncomfortable. And it's this desire that drives us on, not only from moment to moment in this life, if we're still an unawakened person, but that's the desire which pushes us into the next life and actively creates a world. So in Buddhism, we're always creating our existence around us, and that goes for this life as well as future lives. So in Buddhism, consciousness comes from consciousness. So noble truth number 3, this is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering, extinguishing that wanting. Ajahn Brahm's put wanting here. Does anyone know what wanting may be referring back to in Pali? In the chat. Okay, we have Tina Tanha. Okay, great. Brett, grasping? Yeah, there's another word actually which talks about grasping. Normally when we say grasping, it's normally translating for Pali upadana. So like the grasping is what comes after the desire. It's like the next step down the line where you see something and then you actively pick it up and say, this is mine. And Wei Chung says tanha. Sophia says craving. Noveline says chanda. Actually, that's very interesting that you've said that, Noveline. Thank you for saying that. I mean, the answer I was going for was tanha, again, which is, if you're used to Sanskrit Buddhism, tanha is trishna, it's the thirst. I mean, that's what this word literally means. We can see it's literally related to our English word thirst, this feeling of never being happy, of never being satisfied. That's tanha. And I mean, it's interesting that Noveline has said chanda as well, because chanda can, it also means to want something. It can mean also to accept something or to consent to something. So when we have a word like, say, kama chanda, kama chanda is our desire in relation to the sensual word. But this word chanda can sometimes have a positive meaning. So the emotional tone isn't always 100% negative, which is quite interesting, because obviously we do need to have motivation. We have motivation to walk the Noble Eightfold Path. We have motivation to let go of our craving. So we do see sometimes that some motivations can actually be positive. But what's normally meant by tanha is tanha in a negative sense. And that's why the Buddha has given it that extra definition. He's not just talking about wanting, he's talking about that wanting, which is the cause for rebirth. And that's very clear in the Pali. So thank you for sharing that, Noveline. And Carolyn said attachment. Yeah, attachment, I think it's also okay. But in terms of what is actually indicated by the source text, I think maybe the desire, it's a bit clearer, because I mean, normally we can use these words interchangeably in English, your desire, your attachments, but it's a bit hard for me to back translate to Pali. So anyway, I think we all have the picture now, it's your wants, your desires. Okay, so on to number 4. So the path. This is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering, extinguishing that wanting. The end of wanting, the cessation of suffering, is to be realized. So here's the verb, is to be realized. So again, the Buddha, he's already set us a job. He's telling the group of 5, this is what is to be done. And, again, just thinking about what's happened in the Buddha's teaching career up to this point, this group of five, you know, they were originally ascetics who were practicing with the Buddha, you know, practicing various types of asceticism, like starving themselves, you know, going on these extreme fasts. And when they'd seen the Buddha come back to Isipatana, you know, they'd seen that he'd taken food, and they thought that, you know, he's a backslider, he's gone back to a life of luxury. But when he actually came to greet them, you know, originally they said, we're not going to greet the Buddha. But when they saw him, they couldn't say no. So he's teaching his former colleagues who used to practice asceticism with him, and he's actually saying, you know, this is the real job. It's not the self-starvation. It's not the self-mortification. Actually, it's the middle path. So that's what the Buddha is teaching here. The Noble Eightfold Path, which is the middle path. And it's in the text. This is the noble truth of the way leading to the cessation of suffering, the Noble Eightfold Path. The Noble Eightfold Path is to be developed. The Noble Eightfold Path has been developed. Thus, in regard to things unheard before in this generation, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. Actually, this was something I used to ask the monks about. You know, when the Buddha says things unheard before in this generation, you know, what exactly does it mean? And because obviously there were Buddhas in the past, weren't there? Because we have this concept of a Buddha being a cyclical phenomena, that from time to time Buddhas arise in the world. But, you know, what the Buddha means is that he was awakened by himself. He didn't have a teacher. And sometimes the simile he gives for this is like a person discovering a lost city in the jungle. So the Dhamma, the truth, which was awakened to by the Buddha, was something that was there beforehand, but he has rediscovered it. So it's not something that the Buddha invented by his own theorizing. It is a universal truth that he's realized through insight. So as a result of that, vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light have arisen. Are there any questions at this point? I hope the pace is okay. Are we all following? Can we give me a yes or no? Are you following? Yes, following. That's great. Thanks, Elise. So far, so good. Pretty good. Yes, yep, sort of. Okay. That's okay, Carolyn. Because, you know, these are new concepts. The more you hear them, the more they can sink in. And I mean, it is a little bit abstract, because obviously we live our lives. We're embedded people. You know, we don't know, there's no test for it. You can relax. But yeah, when we live our lives, you know, we're living our lives in a human context. We have work, we have relationships, we have families. And sometimes when you see it abstracted out like this, you know, you need to actually sit down and think, you know, yes, there's some suffering, and I can see it on the paper, you know, it's there as a bullet point on a list. But what does it mean in the context of my life, where I have, you know, family members, I have work, I have, you know, maybe I don't have work because of lockdown. So, I mean, that's one of the hard points with actually teaching Buddhist texts, is that, you know, sorry, just got a cough. Is that there's always a translation process involved. And Ajahn Chah used to sum it up in a different way. He used to say, he used to ask, do any of you, have you ever tasted salt? And, you know, you can all put up your hands, and you can all say, yes, I've tasted salt. And he'd ask, you know, if you go to your neighbor's house, does salt also taste salty? And, you know, everyone would say yes. And, you know, what Ajahn Chah was trying to get people to think about is that this truth, it's an experiential truth. So we don't need to go very far to know what this truth of dukkha is, because when we go down to meditate, our body's aching. We're busy. We have stuff going on. There's stuff going on in our heads. Things aren't comfortable. So some of these things are quite easy to see, again, very straightforwardly through meditation. And I mean, personally, when I look at my friends who are still, they have careers, a lot of them, they're very ambitious. They like to compete with people. They'd really like to do anything to get ahead in their work. Some of them, these are my former friends, not my current friends. They're always getting into these relationship difficulties. They have the jealousy, all of the possession, all of the fighting. And the Buddha actually, he talked about all of this social conflict as well as coming from our own desires. So, while these concepts, while they might lack something, they might lack a little bit of flesh now, the more we can use them to see our life, this is called right view, because this is the type of lens that makes it eventually easier for us to let go. So gradually, I hope that things can make a little bit more sense, Carolyn. And, if they don't, that's okay too, because, it's good to ask questions. And I mean, that was one of the things that was really interesting for me coming to Buddhism too, was that Buddhist culture these days in general is quite open to questions. I mean, it depends where you go. If it's a large audience, maybe there mightn't be a lot of time. But certainly Ajahn Brahm and Ajahn Brahm students, we tend to like questions because it's good to think, and it's good to get answers, because the Buddha said, what's the solution for doubt? The solution for doubt is asking questions and getting answers. So we'll go along slowly. Okay. So yeah, that's just a little excerpt from the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, which is the Buddha's first teaching to the group of 5 at the Deer Park at Isipatana. So we're jumping text a little bit now. We're jumping to the Majjhima Nikaya, so we're in the middle length discourses. So reading from the book, I considered, this Dhamma that has been awakened to is profound, hard to see and hard to understand, peaceful and sublime, unattainable by mere reasoning, subtle to be experienced by the wise. But this generation delights in attachment to a self, takes delight in attachment to a self, and rejoices in attachment to a self. It is hard for such a generation to see this truth, namely, the empty process of cause and effect, dependent cessation and origination. Furthermore, it is hard to embrace this truth, namely, the stilling and disappearance of the will, the relinquishing of everything that has been acquired, the destruction of wanting, everything fading away, cessation, Nibbana. There are beings with little dust in their eyes that are wasting through not hearing this Dhamma. There will be those who will understand this Dhamma. Okay, so maybe some new words there. Can anyone give me a brief definition of Dhamma in the chat? Maybe just one word. What's Dhamma in English? Teachings, teaching's great. I'm good. That was truth, law, thing, teachings, law of nature. Yeah, I'm glad that was so easy, because I think if you look at the PTS dictionary definition of Dhamma, I think it takes a whole page. I think there's about 22 different meanings. So if we've just gotten 3, that makes life easier. Dhamma has a lot of meanings. Dhamma can mean teaching, like you pointed out, thanks to Serena, Carolyn, and Verette. It can mean truth, as has been pointed out by Tina. It can mean law, and like law in a very literal sense. When we talk about Paramashastra in Hinduism, what we actually mean is a law book. Law of nature. So actually it's it's a word that has a very wide range of meanings. And it's interesting because Tina's pointed out this meaning of truth. And that's actually a meaning that's quite informative, because this word dharma, it didn't have that meaning before the Buddha. So there is this kind of shift in the meaning that happens. And what happens in Buddhist texts, for the first time, we have the sense of Dhamma being a kind of universal law, as well as being a teaching. So yeah, something quite interesting that happens with Buddhism. So the Buddha said, this Dhamma that has been awakened to is profound, hard to see and hard to understand. But this generation delights in attachment to a self. So when we talk about what the Buddha's main insight was, we talk about his insight into non-self, which is into anatta. And he's saying it's hard to see the truth of non-self. And what he's saying is that it's hard for this, for people these days to see that it's a process of cause and effect, of dependent cessation and origination. So we have two important terms here, dependent origination. Normally when we think of dependent origination, we think of the 12 links of describing, dependent origination is basically the Buddha's answer to why do we suffer. That's fleshed out a little bit more, why is there birth and death? In one sense, it's also the story of consciousness. So we'll be having a look at these 12 links a little bit later. But for now, it's enough to understand that normally, when we think about, who am I, we tend to imagine some type of soul, some type of permanent essence, that there's a me somewhere in there, that there's an eternal consciousness that's, if I can just get things right, I'm going to have this eternally blissful experience, that there's a person that somehow experiences all of this, that there's an essence. And what the Buddha is saying is that, that's missing the point. The point is that actually there's no one in there. And to adopt a simile from the Samyutta Nikaya, you can imagine it's like a bicycle, right? In a bicycle, you can see tires, you can see bike handles, you can see wheel spokes. But, when you take it apart, like where actually is the bicycle? It's just an assembly of parts. So, it's the same with us, right? When we think, oh, do I have a soul? Actually, we're overstepping the evidence, because no one's ever seen, no one's ever seen a soul. No one's ever seen anything that's permanent. All we can say is I've observed this. So the Buddha was an empiricist in that sense, like a scientist. He was focused on what we can actually observe. And, a lot of 20th century philosophy, like Wittgenstein, was also concerned with these questions. What can we actually, what statements, what philosophical statements can actually be given a meaning? So a statement, there is a soul. It's not a statement that can actually be given any real meaning. Would anyone like to argue? Would anyone like to say, yes, there is a soul? What are you telling us, Ayya? Do we have any convinced soul believers?
I have a question.
Oh, sure, that's okay. Go ahead.
So what about enlightenment? So when you've realized the truth, then is there a sense of permanence once you reach that enlightenment? You can see everything clearly. And even though everything's still changing, the nature of the world is impermanent, then what about an enlightened being that's able to be detached from everything that changes?
Sure. So just to make sure, thank you so much for asking that question, Sophia, because I think that is a really important question. And again, it helps me when you have questions. So I'd like to encourage as many of them as possible as we go along. So what Sophia's asked is like, when you get enlightened, right? Does that give you a sense of permanence, you know, when you're seeing everything else change? And in terms of like what actually enlightenment is, we use a couple of different words to talk about awakening experiences in Buddhism. So one of them is Nibbana. So, you know, that process of awakening to the Tevijja, to the free knowledges. So the knowledge of the destruction of the taints, the knowledge of previous lives, and the divine eye. So that's, I mean, that's one way of thinking about Nibbana. Another way of thinking about Nibbana is Nibbana as the breakup of the khandhas. So the parinibbana that the Buddha experiences at the time of death, you know, where all of the things that made up the Buddha's personal experience, you know, they fade. So in terms of, you know, is awakening, is it an experience of permanence? You know, in Buddhism, it's taught us is all the way down. It's all impermanent. There is nothing that's, you know, that somehow survives. There is like no little corner of consciousness that you can say, you know, this is the observer. This is the I. This is the thing that's seeing, and everything else out there is changing. Because what actually happens in meditation experience is that what we call the observer, it also disappears. So the mind, the knower, the thing that does the knowing, you know, we get to see that also vanish. So, I mean, like in terms of what the mind actually is in Buddhism, like in Buddhism, the mind is like a stool that has 3 prongs, so, or 3 legs. So one of those legs is perception, the other leg is emotion, and the third leg is consciousness. So what actually happens, you know, through the higher states of meditation, as we knock out the legs of that stool, we get to see consciousness itself disappearing. So, I mean, sometimes the language that is used to describe Nibbana, you know, it can have a sense of permanence. And like one of the words used to describe Nibbana in the canon is actually duva, you know, which means unchanging. But why is it unchanging? It's unchanging because it's not conditioned. It doesn't mean it's unchanging because there's something there. Because, I mean, just to talk a little bit further on that point, we have a lovely definition of Nibbana here. You know, this definition of Nibbana is very famous. I know it by heart in Pali. So in Pali, it's etang, santang, etang, panitang, yadidang, etc. Yadidang sabha sankara samato, sabha padi, padinisigo, tanhakayo, virago, nirodo, nibbana. So what actually is Nibbana? We have a definition here. The relinquishing of everything that has been acquired. So Nibbana is not a state. You know, Nibbana is a letting go. And that's why we have this word Nibbana. Nibbana literally means extinguishment. So Nir means to go out. Vana is like blowing. So it's like the blowing out of a candle. So, I mean, I hope this, I hope it's not like too mind boggling. So, I mean, Carolyn's spot on, you know, Nibbana is the realization of emptiness. Perfect. So that's what this is saying pretty much. Does that answer your question, Sophia, or am I just making things more complicated than they need to be?
No, not at all. I think it makes sense in a way where like things can only change if they exist. And if you've extinguished desires and everything has seceded, then it's not that they're not changing. It's not that they're no longer changing or permanent. It just means they don't no longer exist. So they don't really.
I think that's to the point because, you know, again, there's a very famous Pali phrase that says "Sabbe sankhara anicca, sabbe sankhara dukkha, sabbe dhamma anatta." So we don't actually say that Nibbana is anicca because that doesn't make sense. You know, we don't say that Nibbana is impermanent. What we say is that all compounded things are impermanent. But we do say that Nibbana is anatta. We do say that Nibbana is non-self. Because the Buddha, like just to go back to that previous point about Nibbana being an extinguishment, you know, the Buddha said that Nibbana, this is in the Udana, is a place where the sun's rays and the moon's rays don't reach, but that doesn't mean that there's darkness. So I think you summed it up quite well, Sophia. Thank you. Okay, we have a comment from Brett. Also, I thought I heard Bhante Sujato mention something about a hell realm. How is that possible if there isn't a me to potentially go there if nothing survives? So, I mean, this is like the, you know, the famous Buddhism 101 question. So, you know, we have, sure, there's such a thing as transmigrating consciousness. Like this is a thing that's accepted in Buddhism. It's accepted that there is a spiritual dimension to reality and that there is such a thing as spiritual realms or spiritual experiences. So some of those spiritual realms would include the hell realm and the ghost realm. So how is it possible that we can have experiences of these states of deprivation? So it's something that's experienced with a mind-made body. So the fact that we have a mind-made body doesn't mean that it's permanent. It doesn't mean that it's a soul. It just means that it's another psychological phenomena. So just like we have bodies now, we have a mind now. The fact that it's there, that we experience, it doesn't mean we can say it's eternal or it's permanent or that it's me. So whether it's now or whether it's in hell, it's the same thing. You know, just a lot of experiences succeeding one after another. So Nibbana is a state of nothingness from Serena. Yeah, I mean, Nirodha Samapatti, you know, you do have like the cessation attainment associated with arahantship. And sure, that's a state of nothingness. But I mean, even, you know, the Buddha also has times when he's engaging in normal cognitive processes. You know, the Buddha has to get up. The Buddha has to, you know, to brush his teeth in the morning or to use the tooth wood. So, you know, there's also times when the Buddha is actively engaging in doing normal human stuff too. So, you know, it's not that the Buddha is not awakened at those times. It's just that, you know, there's the absence of greed, hate, and delusion. There's no perception of the self. And so I think that answered your question. Thank you, Brett. That's great. That's what we're here to do. We're here to get some questions answered. Okay, so there are beings with little dust in their eyes that are wasting through not hearing this Dhamma. There will be those who will understand this Dhamma. So hopefully all of you. So maybe this evening, maybe we'll all go back and become awakened, fingers crossed. So it's getting a little bit, we're getting on with the time. I hadn't quite covered as much as I'd hoped to cover, but that's okay. We can make up time. later on. We had set aside some time for some questions. Do we have more questions? I can hand back to Tina.
There's no questions in the chat as yet. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to just pop it into the chat and I'm happy to moderate that. Or you could also unmute yourself if you prefer to speak your question as well. We've got some time for that. I suppose a lot of people had asked their questions during the talk as well, so that may be also why it's a bit quiet. But if anyone has a question, feel free to put that into the chat.
Yeah, that's okay. We can keep on moving with the text because I think we can squeeze in. Oh, it's a bit long, isn't it? I was hoping we could get through up to about page 12 this evening. But anyway, we'll keep reading and we'll see how we go with it.
Okay.
Yeah. So the noble truth of suffering. So we're giving a little bit more meat around what we've talked about previously. And what is the noble truth of suffering? And just to mention too, while I'm thinking about it, this word dukkha is actually made up of two components. So the first part is the root dush. The second part is the verbal root ka. So ka actually means to bear up, to endure something. So when we have dush plus ka, those two parts of the word combine to give us dukkha. So what it literally means, dukkha, is that we're faring poorly in the world. We're faring badly. So the opposite is sukha. Again, from this root su, meaning well, the prefix su, plus ka, meaning to fare. So if you're faring well in the world, then you have sukha, then you're happy. So two new words for today. We have dukkha and sukha. So now the Buddha is talking about the truth of suffering, the truth of dukkha. So rebirth is suffering, aging is suffering, death is suffering, sorrow, lamentation, pain, negativity, and distress are suffering. Experiencing what is unpleasant is suffering. Missing what is pleasing is suffering. Not getting what one wants is suffering. In short, the five components of existence, the five khandhas that fully describe your body and mind, are suffering. So again, we have another new word. We have this word khandha. Khandha literally means like a heap or like a pile of stuff. And it's, the fact that the Buddha has introduced some of these concepts is really quite revolutionary. Before the Buddha in the Upanishads, people were starting to think about, to develop a concept of psychology that, our experience, it presents itself to us just as a glob, kind of like this undifferentiated mass. And what the Buddha is doing here, he's separating out that undifferentiated glob of experience we have in the sensory world, and he's giving it some categories. So we're going to be talking about these categories, the five khandhas, a little bit more. And what the Buddha is saying, that everything you are made up of is suffering. And some interesting words here, negativity. It's suffering, but, everything could be included here. Back pain is suffering. Knee pain is suffering. That annoying person at work is suffering. The kids not doing what they're told is also suffering. But, in Buddhism, Buddhism can be a little bit radical sometimes. In Buddhism, the whole lot is suffering. The mere fact that I'm born, I didn't choose to be born. The fact that I have to undergo sense experience, I never chose voluntarily to do that. It was forced upon us. It's sense experience. It's not pretty. There are things like chronic migraines and stuff in the world. So, you know, even the fact that we have to have a body that bumps into stuff all the time, you know, that's actually suffering. And the fact that we have minds, you know, that's also suffering, because none of us ever really had a voluntary choice that I'm going to have this mind that's, you know, is forced to perceive things whether I want it to or not. I have no control over the fact that I'm conscious. You know, if the anesthetist knocks me out, you know, I can't say, you know, let me be conscious. It's, you know, it's not actually up to me. So, yeah, Buddhism says, like, literally the whole lot is suffering. So, you know, the Buddha's being a bit revolutionary here. Carolyn's commented, but being reborn, is that not caused by karma? And exactly, that's the point, you know, that because rebirth is caused by karma, it's not under my voluntary control. It's under the control of natural processes, one of which is moral causality, which we call karma. Okay, so Wei Chung has asked, so the 5 khandhas in itself is suffering, or the attachment to 5 khandhas is suffering? So again, a couple of different types of dukkha. So, you know, one type of dukkha is called dukkha. So dukkha is, you know, it's dukkha in the very pure sense. It is the fact that merely having a body will cause us dukkha. And we can see this when the Buddha, you know, when the Buddha was hit in the foot with the rock by Devadatta, you know, he had to go get it bandaged up. So yes, having 5 khandhas in itself is, you know, it's suffering. That, you know, we only get released from that suffering at the time of parinibbana. So, you know, what we're concerned with when we're talking about craving, actually, we are concerned with the attachment. It's true, because the Buddha said, you know, they're not the problem, the pretty things in the world. And the term he used for that was chitrani loke. You know, the beautiful stuff in the world is not actually the issue. The issue is the craving. So, yeah, what we're mainly concerned with is the craving. When we say the Buddha, you know, is liberated from the khandhas, what we mean is at the time of parinibbana, the khandhas break up, and, you know, there is no more future existence. Okay, so from Carolyn, but don't we create our own karma? Yes, we do. But again, you didn't voluntarily choose to live in a world where you create karma. It's part of the natural order of the universe. Again, not voluntarily within your control. So might the senses being considered suffering be caused by the Buddha's meditation experiences of the senses being suppressed? I mean, that's I wasn't quoting from the Pali Canon, and I was quoting from my own perception. So I mean, yeah, in meditation, you know, we do experience the senses as suffering because we come out of meditation and maybe we've been blissing out in some type of realm where we don't have sense experience, and then we come back and, you know, it's all a bit too much. I mean, sure, you can have that type of experience, but there's also a type of dukkha called viparinama dukkha, which is the dukkha you have because things change. And because things change, we know that they're not under our control. So because the senses change, because the senses are not under your control, you know, that's these are the Buddha's words for why the senses are suffering. And we'll be looking a little bit more at that later on. So, you know, again, to quote the Buddha's actual words, the Buddha said, "Sabbe sankhara dukkha," you know, all compounded things are dukkha. So sankhara being, you know, what is compounded, what's put together, what's dependently originated, all dukkha. And, you know, the definition should be self-evident. Why is it dukkha? Because it is dependently originated. You know, it's the type of causality involved. It has nothing to do with us. It's due to nature. It changes. And therefore it is not as we may wish. So moving on. I mean, some of these points, they are actually, they're quite difficult points psychologically to come to terms with as well. You know, if we could come to terms with it psychologically, we would be awakened. And, you know, even a lot of Buddhists, they don't want to come to terms with it. You know, there is a trend within certain types of Buddhism that wants, you know, that does want Nirvana to be the eternal retirement home where you can go to when you die, where it can be happy, blissful, really existing, permanent, and you can have some type of foothold in the world and like everything's okay. But, you know, the Buddha's Buddhism, you know, it's a path to be walked with joy, it's a path to be walked with bliss, but it's the bliss born of letting go. And we get to see that directly in meditation. You know, we see the less we have of our senses, the less we have of our mind, you know, the more blissful it is. And that's why these, you know, these yogis and monks and people, why they can just sit in meditation for days and not have to come out or eat anything because they're blissing out. You know, like the less foothold we have in the world, you know, the more pure and beautiful that experience is. And because in Buddhism, we talk about two types of happiness. We have the type of happiness that comes from sensuality, and we have the type of happiness that comes from, you know, giving up sensuality. And what the Buddha said is that the type of happiness that comes from giving up sensuality is superior. So really quite interesting, you know, what we can actually see directly in an empirical sense through meditation. Okay, I'm going to have to wrap up there because otherwise we're going to run out of time. When we come back next week, we can continue to read from number 1, from the Noble Truth of Suffering. Okay, so have I said anything outrageous, or are you all going to let me all go?
I don't think anything outrageous, but I can see that there are a number of questions that's come up. Perhaps what we could do is I'll keep a copy of these questions, and if you don't mind, next week we can go through some of these questions as well.
Okay, sure. I think that sounds great. We can do that. So thank you so much, everyone. And, you know, yeah, it's just a real pleasure to work through the text and to spend some time with the Buddha's word.
Thank you so much, Ayya. Thank you so much for sharing your experience as well. And for those who've asked a question and we haven't gone back to you, come back next week. Okay, so stay tuned. And I really hope everyone will be back next week as we continue on with the session and the course as well. So have a wonderful week, everyone, and I hope to see you all soon. Thank you so much, Ayya.
Okay, thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.